On the issue of busing, obviously that is personal to me. I remember getting on that yellow bus. And so many of us do. And interestingly enough, since I've talked about it, people who I don't know have reached out. They also, especially in the 70s, all across the country, all across our country, people were bused. People just like me.
I heard and I listened to and I respect Senator Harris. But, we all know that 30 seconds to 60 seconds on a campaign debate exchange can't do justice to a lifetime committed to civil rights. I never, ever opposed voluntary busing. And as a program that Senator Harris participated in, and it made a difference in her life. I did support federal action to address root causes of segregation in our schools and our communities. I've always been in favor of using federal authority to overcome state-initiated segregation.
That's former Vice President Joe Biden speaking on Friday to a largely African-American audience at the Reverend Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push Coalition in Chicago. Biden continues to respond to his opposition to busing, which was a flashpoint, of course, between him and Senator Kamala Harris in Thursday night's debate. In the new Morning Consult poll conducted after both debate nights, Biden is at 33%, dropping 5 points from the beginning of last week. Senator Bernie Sanders remains level at 19%. Senator Harris has doubled her support, though, up 6 points to 12%. Senator Elizabeth Warren is tied for third at 12%. Mayor Pete Buttigieg down to 6%. Senator Cory Booker at 3%. Beto O'Rourke and Andrew Yang each at 2%. The Daily Beast reports that data compiled by the Democratic polling firm Democracy Corps showed Biden's favorability with African-American voters actually going up a net 18% after the debate. Pollster Stan Greenberg chalked that up to defensiveness over the perception that the attacks on Biden were attacks on the Obama-Biden legacy. But the same survey also showed the percentage of people who would vote for Biden and consider voting for him went down 11 points from 81% to 72%. Joining us now, White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, Yamiche Alcindor, and New York Times reporter Jeremy Peters. Good morning to you both. Yamiche, let me start with you. As we put the Morning Consult poll up, it shows Kamala Harris, I think, as a lot of people expected, getting a nice bump from her performance at the debate. Joe Biden ticking down just a bit. How big a problem do you suspect this busing question is for Joe Biden in a Democratic primary?
Well, the exchange between Joe Biden and Senator Harris really went to the core issues at stake in the Democratic primary, and that is issues of identity, issues of diversity, issues of representation. I think when we talk about the idea that she went after him for busing, she also said at the very beginning of that exchange, as the only black woman on this stage, I want to have a moment to talk about race. And what she was doing there was saying, look, I'm going to be able to talk about the fact that I'm a woman and that I'm black and make that central to my campaign, which she has done all along, while also bringing, of course, all her merits to the stage. And I've been talking to civil rights activists across the country who tell me that they're not really trying to let up on this, that they want to keep talking about Joe Biden's history. They see it as problematic. So I think if Senator Harris continues to build on this momentum, then she could continue to see a rise in the polls. Her campaign over the weekend sent out some new fundraising numbers. They say they raised about $2 million right after the debate. So what you see is that she's not just rising in polls, but she's also getting more money. So I think Senator Harris, she might at some point become the front runner, but this is a long race. So in other words, I think Joe Biden also has this idea that he has all the support from Jesse Jackson and other people who have questioned his busing policies, but who are also open to having him in forums and hosting him. And he's gotten support from people like John Lewis and Jim Clyburn as well, just in the last couple of weeks. Jeremy, the President of the United States obviously not been shy about going after some of the members of the field in the Democratic primary here, but hasn't had much to say about Senator Harris since this campaign launched. And you've got some new reporting this morning that they're a little bit concerned about her as an opponent. Well, Willie, what Joe Biden's performance and Kamala Harris's confrontation of him on Thursday night did was kind of reset a couple of important assumptions about the race. One, it gave us a glimpse of what she might look like as a debate sparring partner against President Trump, and it was a pretty fierce performance. Number two, it kind of shattered this aura of invincibility, of dominance that Joe Biden had enjoyed for a really long time. And the Trump campaign, President Trump himself especially, hasn't really figured out how to
deal with Kamala Harris. He knows how to attack somebody like Elizabeth Warren, right? He can ridicule her for the Pocahontas thing. He can call her goofy. He knows how to go after Joe Biden. He's told aides, the reporting in the story that Annie Carney and I had in the Times over the weekend showed, he's told aides that he sees Joe Biden as a male version of Hillary Clinton. This is familiar territory for him. But when it comes to a female adversary, President Trump has shown time and time again that he does not take criticism from women well at all. Couple that with the fact that she is a minority, and I just don't think he can handle that. He having that on top of a criticism from an African-American woman, a prosecutor who knows how to go for his weaknesses, knows how to go for the weaknesses of all of her opponents, as she demonstrated with Joe Biden. It's just not something he's processed, and he's been unable to really settle on a line of attack about her, and we'll kind of see how that plays out.
So during Thursday's Democratic debate, Donald Trump Jr. shared a tweet that questioned Senator Kamala Harris's race. The retweet of alt-right commentator Ali Alexander said, quote, Kamala Harris is implying she's descended from American black slaves. She is not. She comes from Jamaican slave owners. That's fine. She's not an American black, period, this person wrote. Trump Jr. shared the tweet, writing, is this true? Wow. By the end of the night, he had deleted that retweet. On Friday, a spokesperson for Don Jr. told the New York Times it had been a misunderstanding, and the tweet was simply him asking if it was true that Kamala Harris was half Indian, because it's not something he'd ever heard before. And once he saw that folks were misconstruing the intent of his tweet, he quickly deleted it. Yamiche Alcindor, I think a lot of people saw this early line of attack on Kamala Harris and said, here we go again, with reflections back to the birther movement, of which Donald Trump was the lead cheerleader.
Well, what we learned from Donald Trump Jr. deleting that tweet is that birtherism 2.0 likely will not work, because people have now seen it. And let's just put it out plainly. When you're questioning someone's background of African-American descent, it's simply racist what was going on there. This idea that somehow Senator Harris being of Indian and Jamaican descent somehow doesn't make her have the African-American experience when she was born in America and was bused in America is really just something that gets at the core of these issues that we're dealing with still, which is that people want to really try to look for ways to really divide the African-American community and say, well, your boat stopped in Jamaica and your boat stopped in Haiti, so you two should not get along. That is, again, simply racist. So I think that people are smarter this time around. I think people are ready to call this out very quickly. And I think that's why you saw Donald Trump Jr. Delete that tweet. It goes back to what Jeremy was saying. They just simply don't know how to deal with Senator Harris now, but they've learned that birtherism is not going to be the way that they're going to be able to deal with her.
You're right. It is racist garbage that used to exist on the fringes, but has been elevated now by people like Don Jr. retweeting it. Meanwhile, the first fundraising numbers of the second quarter are in, and the Pete Buttigieg campaign says it has raised nearly $25 million from 294,000 donors, with an average contribution of less than $48. The campaign says it has more than $22 million in cash on hand. Jeremy Peters, that is an eye-popping number for a guy who sort of more quietly also had a good night in the debate.
That's absolutely right, Willie. It's enormous. And that comes from 400,000 donors over the course of the first and second quarter, the campaign's reported. So that suggests a real grassroots movement there for Pete Buttigieg. It also shows, though, that he's had a lot of success, as we've reported, raising money from more traditional sources of Democratic campaign finance. You have Silicon Valley, Hollywood, there's an awful lot of LGBT money in there, too. So, he's kind of spreading himself out in a pretty strategic way here, Willie. I would say, though, however, that these numbers are lagging indicators. They're not leading indicators. They've told us what he raised in the second quarter. Now, he's had a couple notable political stumbles. This issue in South Bend with the anger in the African-American community over the police shooting has been a real problem for him. Is he going to be able to get past that? Has that kind of dented his popularity? We haven't seen all that many poll numbers to tell us anything along those lines, but money isn't everything, and he's got to be a consistent performer on the campaign trail going forward, and we'll just have to see how that plays out.
22 million will keep you around for a while.
It's a good substitute for consistency. Yamiche, I've got a question for you. It's now July. The next Democratic debates come at the end of this month. Is there any talking about changing the format or the criteria for participation? Or because there is an argument that this does not help the candidates or the strength of who's ever going to be at the top of the ticket. And do you see that the party establishment is rethinking the question of thresholds for participation in order to shrink the number of people standing on the stage?
I'm not quite sure if we're going to see a different format. What we saw was that it was obviously hard for some candidates to get in. You think of Andrew Yang and Marianne Wilson. They both talked for only a couple minutes each. So I think what we're seeing is that people realize that if you want a vigorous debate about policies, you might want to whittle that down a bit. But at the same time, you have Democrats that are still raising a lot of money, that are still in some ways polling pretty well, and it's still so early that I think when you saw two debate nights, they were obviously very different, but a lot of people that I talked to, especially Democrats, said that they liked the idea that it was about policy, vigorous policy debates. It wasn't about who can go after Donald Trump the most. So I think we'll have to see whether or not CNN, who I think has the next debate in Detroit, whether or not they look at the what happened with NBC and says, okay, well, maybe we should change this.
Jeremy Peters, thank you very much. You may stay with us if you can. Still ahead, the Supreme Court has officially wrapped up its 2019 term after rulings on two major cases dealing with the 2020 census and with gerrymandering. We'll talk about how those rulings may play out and what's ahead in the next term when Morning Joe comes right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.